I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on the 18th of October 2020. And I hope you're all hanging in there as we go through, well, we're actually down the throat, not just in the mouth of madness, but down the throat of it too. And we're somewhere way down low. We'd rather not be, obviously. Mind you may get expelled on the other end, and then you have freedom again. Because we're going through incredible times, pre-planned agendas. They took years and years to plan all this, you know. And it's interesting even to come across writers who are catching on now, who weren't in this part of the game, you might say. And now they've caught on that this is this was designed years ago, this whole agenda. Governments don't come out with unified agreements in such detail for implementation, just like that. Governments take years to implement anything, except taxing you. You know, they can always adjust your taxes and rob you, as they always have done. But we're going through an amazing agenda, and it goes way back, many years. In fact, it came out rather more openly in the 1970s. I've mentioned this before with the Club of Rome and the First Global Revolution, a book that came out with two. They're a big, massive think tank that works on behalf of the true globalists and the United Nations as well. You got to understand, the world is not run by your politicians. It really isn't. They can hire these politicians a dime a dozen because they're psychopaths. They have histories, not pleasant histories generally too. They're all blackmailable, and they'll all do anything they're told to appease their masters and their paymasters ultimately. And it's not the public that they serve, and that's the truth of it. That is the truth of it. And it's not just recent either. It's been on this way for an awful long time. You can't go through history without shaking your head until it's ready to fall off, you know. That must be COVID. But the thing is, you keep stumbling across these incredible admissions that are in records, governmental records, from different countries. That really, I mean, you understand, you're going through a whole lockdown of a whole planet, pretty well. All unified, as I say, lockstep from the Rockefeller plan in 2010. They mentioned that term, and it was much older than that. But you've seen it before. You don't realize you've seen these things before because you weren't alive then. maybe some of you are lucky enough to be well over 100. But when you look at the huge agendas of change on the world and power plays, and treaties that bound countries together so that they go to war collectively against other potential enemies. It might have been their friends yesterday, but they might have discovered gold on their land or something. So the allied nations would go and invade them to make sure they didn't squander the gold, you know, inappropriately. And that's the kind of things that history's really made up of, you know. The history of England is interesting, like most countries. It's interesting when you look at the machinations that went on in history. They call it the Dark Ages at one point, a bad name indeed. But what they try to say is that not much happened for a long time. Well, lots of things happened for over many centuries in England and Britain. It wasn't dark at all, you know. But you find that the monasteries at one point had a big say across the whole of Europe. And they brought some kind of order in, because people were pretty barbaric at times, and they didn't have a unified code of ethics and anything. Never mind, thou shalt not. But you had definitely a kind of beginnings of a commercial structure. Again, using money. I'm not all for that either, mind you. But that's the technique that came in with really the Normans, big time. Was more so that the use of money and taxation came along with it, and there was always feuding that went on between the nobility and the religious orders. The religious orders did stand up for the people, you know. That believe it or not, actually did, and it became a nuisance at times for nobility and kings. So you never had a perfect peace on the planet. A big story to that too. That's a completely different thing. It's a spiritual story. And I've mentioned it before, and I won't go into it in too much detail, but the fact is, this is the middle plane, as they used to call it. The earth, you see, the earth. And above you have spirit, but which also combines on the earth, and then you have matter itself, which is the world of matter. And the two are always in conflict, you see. It's the same with you as a person. You're composed of two different elements. Maybe most of you, I don't know about all of you, but the fact is, you always have this thing inside you. There's something bigger than just all this. And you hope there is, because look around you. Look around you. And all you get dished out by the system are professors and doctors of this and doctors of that, to guide you, etc. And as time goes on, you use more tax money to train more of these professors and doctors of all kinds, and put up their commercial system of universities that serves an elite that is well established over many centuries. Then are you really surprised about the mess you're in? Because every mess that's created by their sciences, you are the product too. You make money for the solutions to the problem that they claim is there. And they make money off of you like a giant herd, eh? And that's how they talk about you, for goodness sake, And that's the world of money and matter, you see. And even the word mother is partly derives from the same root. Motor, mother, is matter. You're born from matter in a sense. So that's always your battle. In the world of pure matter, survival of the fittest, as the Darwinians like to call it, has always been paramount, even before Darwin came along to reiterate the same phrase. Because the nobility always talked about blue bloods and the rest of you, and there were villains and vermin, etc. And peasants. You were slaves. Serf is just another word for a slave, a form of slavery. And the world of matter, you're trained in the world of matter, more so through the 20th century, and really speeding up to the 21st century, where now they teach you to worship those with the most coinage, you might say. And that's all you'll see about celebrities, of all kinds. So you have a massive machine that creates stars from musicians to whatever, actresses, and also stars of science now. They give you these front people and say, these are geniuses, like Carl Sagan thing that was meant to influence a lot of folks' minds. And they present them and really produce their shows for them, and they make them stars, and you'll follow the stars. And so their opinions become yours, because you're just a silly little serf, and they're obviously a genius according to all the newspapers. You never catch on. You really never catch on. Most folk never catch on to this system that they're living in. And it's sad. That's terribly, terribly sad. They want, there's a truism that a lot of people want to grovel towards what they think are their betters, and to make themselves subservient to them. I've mentioned it before with a book that was put out on the Rockefellers as an example. And it's an interesting book. It's factual, and the history of the family, and how the old man Rockefeller, they don't go in too deeply about all the scams that they did to get their money, because they were monopolists. The system you live under in the Rockefeller family is one part of a collection of families are monopoly. They don't believe in sharing wealth. They don't believe either that you should have too much of it. They want to control the means of survival for everybody on the planet. That's food, all energy systems, and food it comes into energy, of course, and transportation. Everything is to be under their domain. That hasn't changed. It's the same group, by the way, this massive monopoly of certain families that run what's called this New World Order. The plan has never changed, and I've talked about the British side of it with the Lord Alfred Milner group that really helped set up the latter part of the British Empire, and they ran it, and their members ran it, and they talked about creating wars to advance their agenda. And of course they already had, once they had wars going, they sent their own members in to take over the resources of the countries which they vanquished. And again, they had their false flag systems. They literally created the Boer War and blamed the Boers for it. It was also a setup, the Jameson raid. And it's explained by Carl Quigley, who did a lot of he got access to the historical records of the CFR, Royal Institute for International Affairs, that there was a next stage of the Milner Group and the kindergarten. However, it hasn't changed. They don't believe, like old Rockefeller believed, that competition was a sin, and so he was literally annihilating everybody else that was trying to get into the energy business of oil and gas, and even kerosene, for instance. Everything that you needed for light or heat and so on, he was taking over. And it's a religious, he really meant it, that competition is a sin. You understand they have a certain particular religion, these characters, and they're put on the planet to dominate everybody else that doesn't have the common sense to wisen up and see for what it all is. You really don't have much of a chance under this system. And what you're living through today is the next part of the agenda. They've been hammering you for years. When they hit upon the climate scam, remember, I've gone through these talks. I know there's a Dr. Coleman. He's one of the guys who in the last few years or recently has caught up to the old talks that I and others have done years and years ago on this agenda. And I think he's using some of it too from archives, but he's seeing some of it. It took years and years to set up, as I say. But it's not just this part of a system. As I'm saying, this is a continuation of a long-term agenda. But he did talk about the talks I gave years ago on the Club of Rome, and what they said they were tasked to do as a think tank, a massive think tank. Now, don't forget who the members of the Club of Rome are. It's the same members that gave you the population bomb, Paul Ehrlich and so on. His wife was also a founding member on the board of the Club of Rome. It's a small world when you get down to it. You see who manages so many different think tanks and aspects of the same big agenda. But they also had the coming ice age years ago before that, so then the global warming scam. It's all a continuation of how to terrify the public to give up your rights, and that's what the Club of Rome said they were tasked with. They find some excuse so that where the folk would see it as almost reasonable to give up all their rights to be guided by the elite, and to basically, which is really a depopulation agenda, and now under the guise of sustainability. Because they said that man would be the enemy, and that would fit the bill: plagues, famines, and droughts, and so on. Meaning man-made, anthropogenic, right? That would fit the bill, and so man would be the enemy, and that's what you've been hammered with for years and years from all. And this conglomerate media associations that own all the different information, they're all on board with the same agenda, hammering you for years and years and years. It's all your fault, yada yada yada. And they couldn't get us to stop eating and stop purchasing things, and so bing bang, you get the COVID. So that was obviously plan B, that was set up years and years ago to fulfill the big task of bringing in sustainability and austerity, you see, austerity. And when you're into the global reset and the fourth global revolution, it's spelled out for you in black and white what I'm talking about for sustainability, and you've got to go into less consuming, and eventually, of course, they want to, as I've said for years, eliminate high protein diets like any kind of meat eventually, for the general masses, not for the elite. And so you're living through a huge agenda, remembering too that there's a generation now, a lot of them in the streets actually, who are so skinny, but they literally are they're activists for Extinction Rebellion, being trained through their college, even from their early schooling, to be radicals for this, you see. They don't know that. They don't know they were trained deliberately with their minds poisoned, so they can never, there'll be no debate ever with them on anything, because they're indoctrinated. This is what you get when you get indoctrinated children. They become indoctrinated adults, and they become terribly dangerous because they can become homicidal, and that's what you use for revolutions. And all revolutions, as far as I'm concerned, are run by the same select group at the top across the world. Now, it's said too that you couldn't have the BLM protests at the same time with Antifa going around threatening folk in the streets, and no one's coming to the rescue of the ordinary citizenry at all. You've got mayors calling them off. They're well paid and funded, and they're put in their place by the same characters. They're bringing you the world austerity that you're going into, and the world lockdowns, by the way. A small group runs the world, really. And the answer is not just to keep fighting the facts, because facts don't matter. I gave the new normal talks back in the 90s. They would give you new normals. Everybody's picked up on that one. And I explained to them that they always give you new normals. It was on a show I was on, and I came out with it. It was on international radio at the time. And I talked about new normals, how it had been used before, but that I used the term, and I wrote a poem about it as well. And that's how they do it. They give you new normals, which are new realities, you see. And any reality becomes normal after a little while. And I was thinking about that, and I thought about all these folk there. Yeah, you've got all the paid protesters, the leaders, who get pension plans and the whole thing, by the way. But for doing what they're doing, because they work for big foundations and intelligence agencies. Their followers don't know. But you definitely do have a written off generation. And again, we've been through the generations Y's all the way to Z and so on. And written off in a post-working society. They're going to be given universal basic credits for a little while, mind you, a basic income, for a little while, but not forever. Because you're supposed to go down the tube, and you're supposed to eventually, I'm not kidding you, this is like Logan's Run, but you're supposed to eventually start to, and you'll see it, you're going to see people volunteering within the next 15, 20 years to youngsters for euthanasia to save the world. We've already had, I remember giving a talk many years ago, and I said, you'll shortly see youngsters coming out saying they like to be sterilized, to say that we've already had that happen. But now it's the next step. That you'll see that happening, no doubt about it, because you can indoctrinate the youth by incredible techniques today. You know, they're so well understood and well perfected. The techniques of indoctrination, they can literally wrap your emotions around in like a spiral until you'll be delighted to help the world and get your photographs, maybe in interviews, the newspaper, before you're sacrificed in some way or another. So everything that's happened has happened, and eons gone by with sacrifices. King for a day. King for a day is awfully important, folks, because those who rule the world have much more inside of them than you'd imagine. You certainly wouldn't like what's in them if you really understood it. It isn't just psychopathy, it's the symptoms of psychopathy. I've mentioned this before. I've also mentioned if you go into psychopathy and you line up the signs and symptoms, you can also get the similar signs and symptoms of someone who's possessed to a certain extent. There are different kinds of possession, you understand, and harassment. But when you get real possession, and when you get perfect possession, they won't act out as though they're just going to scream and do crazy things and so on. That can happen too, but they can be very calm, in fact, and very powerful. But at the same time, they can stand back and help, not just plan wars, but order wars and slaughters across the world, and they'll validate what they're doing. In almost scientific terms of necessity, you see. They're very believable, and that's a technique of a psychopath, believability. Great manipulators. And often they're likable too. It can be hard to hate a psychopath, even one who has decided to have wars, which you'll do the fighting for and the dying for, and the folk on the other end of it will be dying too. But they're quite calm about it. The Kissinger type jumps to my mind, and others of his ilk as well, and the late Brzezinski too. They're definitely, these characters are definitely, there's something beyond just simple psychopathy there. As far as I'm concerned, that's my opinion. But when you're close to some of these people, you sense it, you'll sense something otherworldly about them. To me, it's physically tangible, and I can't even live in cities because of the neurotic energy that I sense in cities. The only time I can get peace in a city is in the middle of the night when most folk are sleeping. You feel that it's more of a calmness. It sets in a different brainwave or something. But I personally can't live in a city and I won't live in a city because of the madness in it. Cities really have a long history in the occult as to why they're there, in fact, and what they serve. Even the folk who live in them often don't know it themselves. When you're caught in something like a whirlpool, you don't realize it at times until it's too late. And that's what cities are. They're magnets. They're again neon lights that attract the moths. You're the moth and you get attracted to the lights, and for a while you'll be hypnotized by it. I think it's wonderful and so on, until you realize now you're caught and trapped because your rent will be atrociously high and you got to work at some awful job and maybe a few jobs to try and get the money to pay it, and you can't even save up to get out of it eventually. So it's a big trap. And I was thinking about that too. There's a whole other side of the occult too. The city idea goes back thousands of years. And I've mentioned this years ago too, when I did the old talks about Cain. Cain, again, a rebel, and what Cain symbolizes. A lot of the characters in the Bible symbolize not just people, but really techniques, states of being that will repeat itself over and over. But Cain, but you have Cain, who literally was condemned for killing his brother, and you have this odd conversation in the Bible where God asks Cain, "Where's your brother?" And he says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" So much more to that little statement too, of what it really signifies, because the system we're in is an evil system. I have no doubt about it. This system of the material world that you're sunk into, and you're taught to worship the richest folk on the planet. They make them stars and celebrities, and folk will grovel in front of them, just like, as I mentioned before, Rockefeller, after he had the militias turn on the strikers in their tents and machine gun them, families, when the miners were striking. He got a bad name, and so he employed two early public relations experts that knew, by the way, Bernays, and they knew each other. One became Prime Minister of Canada. Eventually, that was his reward. And they remade Rockefeller to be a benevolent character who went round the miners to help. He went round with publicity campaigns, some of the miners' houses, these shacks they lived in, and sympathized with them. And the author said it's so sad to see the ordinary people who'd been abused, and a lot of them killed, in the relatives and so on, groveling. They kowtow, like they doff the hat type of thing. They feel humble in front of this powerful, wealthy guy. Already, that's the power of the personalities that they give to oversee the world. They're demons, these characters. That's what they are. There's no doubt about it. The public relations campaigns that they do can convince the people of anything, but people will, a lot of folk will kowtow to you should look them in the eye, for goodness sake. You don't doff. It's like kneeling, all this kneeling stuff that they're trying to train you to do. You don't kneel for any human being. It took us centuries to fight that. Centuries to get off our knees. And so slickly, you've been throughout the old guilt complex. It's got nothing to do with reality. That try to train you to on the, don't get on your knees for any human being. Huh? It's so, folk have no idea of the psychological warfare that's played on them by teams and teams, like panels of experts, huge think tanks dedicated to each part of this agenda. Not just the COVID idea with the SAGE group in Britain and their Psyop warriors that work with them, and that's all been published by the groups in the SAGE. They were telling the media to intensify the fear in their stories, right, about to try to exacerbate anxiety in the public so they'll comply with orders. Can you believe that? And you're going to do it all again, back on your knees. Okay, Massa, well, okay. Folk have to redeem some dignity, at least some of them. Most won't. I gave these talks many, many years ago. That most folk literally will give up everything for security. Not just me, other people did. Bill Cooper did it too. Where they would give up freedom for security, and a lot of folk, he said, would love socialism because you don't have to think about anything. No big decisions to make because they're all made for you. And that, of course, is what the New World Order, the whole world, the global reset idea and the fourth industrial revolution, as a cradle-to-grave monitoring system. And you won't have a thought of your own pretty well. Maybe the most you'll have is what movie to watch. That's about it. But everything else will be made for you. Where you can go that day, how to get there from your home to that place. Will you be allowed to go out at all? Because you understand the COVID is not supposed to ever go away. And Bill Gates has already said, and others to follow. What do he means by that? This is your whole life under a form and an excuse by medical tyranny. It's a beautiful tyranny, really, isn't it? Anything else, the guns in the streets and the black uniforms and the jackboots of Orwell's 1984, they don't even need that totally at the moment, because I've already got most of the folk complying. They just bring out people with white coats on. What a cheap way to do it, eh? At least it costs more money for the uniforms and the black outfits and armament. But people with cheap white coats on are going to tell you what you must do and how you must live. Huh? And then they've got the psych experts too, and how to cope with it. And even them, they'll give them white. What's a white coat got to do with your brain? Unless they're opening it up, eh? But this is the nonsense we're going through. Medical tyranny is really pretty beautiful. And again, I've said before, it follows right along the agenda of Bertrand Russell when he talked about if there's to be a tyranny, which he wanted. He wanted to eradicate the old system where folk could decide for themselves what they want to do, what they want to work at, etc. He belonged to the same groups that H.G. Wells belonged to. They said there's too many folk is trying to start small businesses up and do the same kind of work and compete. Well, that's what free enterprise really is about. They don't believe in that, you see. So Bertrand Russell said, he said, attorney is what we need, and if it's to be attorney to make it all happen, he would much prefer it to be a scientific attorney. And so here you have it. You're all going to die. You're all going to die by something you can't see. Not only that, they can't see it either, the people who said you might have it. It's all, they give you nice pictures of things, drawings, They're awfully good at drawings. I can remember when they were getting the AIDS pandemic going, the big scare. And many years ago. And they showed you ambulance workers stopping at road accidents and things, or folk collapsing in the streets for other reasons or whatever, but mainly road accidents. And you see that the ambulance attendants back then who were getting in the same kind of propaganda you're getting now with COVID. Eh? They were terrified to go near the people lying on the ground in road accidents, and you'd see them almost crawling along the ground towards the person who was knocked down with cars. And they've got the gloves on and all the rest of it, because at that time it was played up to be the most deadly disease ever, I was going to say invented, but or created, ever developed by nature. Eh? And it really terrified everybody. And you saw wards at one time, very quickly, of folk who were dying. The early victims were nothing like what you're seeing today. They were, from diagnosis to death, it was generally about a year. And it was like all the symptoms you would get with cancers. That's what it was like. So quite kind of awful. So the many folks, there's a different thing that they had initially, And there's all kinds of accusations. Well, they were giving us all these free hepatitis shots and so on, experimental, and that's what they claimed, and to certain groups that came down with the HIV. And that battle still goes on yet today, but most folk have accepted now the official version. But back then, the ambulance drivers and helpers were terrified of it, because they didn't know it was airborne. If the blood evaporated on the ground, you might breathe it in, for goodness sake, and get that's how terror works in the mind, until you're basically almost immobilized from helping other people, even if it's your job. We saw that with the COVID, with the old folks' homes in Montreal and different places. The staff fled eventually and left the patients. So that's what terror does. So it's well understood how, by the medical authorities and those who run everything, how effective it can be, an unseen disease. And I don't think they've given us a drawing yet, though, of the COVID. Oh, they have. All you see is like these old sea lions used to get. I guess they still use them. Like balls that would float in the sea. Steel balls, basically, packed with explosives. And they had spikes all over the place sticking out of them. And these spikes were detonators, really. They'd get driven in by the impact hitting a ship. And they would ignite, and boom, up goes the mine and the explosive and the ship. And that's really what I think they got the idea from the COVID from, the same kind of idea. But they've given lots of the same pictures. It's always the same kind of picture that they've drawn about it, haven't they? They haven't shown you a real thing, but they've shown the pictures that they've drawn about it, and they've all these theories of how it works and so on. But with the HIV one, they literally said, the top experts, and it says, we really suspect that this virus has the head of a bacterium and the body of a virus, or maybe vice versa. But they showed you this picture. It was like something in a horror movie with eyes and everything. And that's what terrified the public into compliance and to the so-called safe sex things and so on that were going on. But that's what they do. They give you nice drawings. It's the same with all the different moon landings they showed you. I can remember watching one of them, and one part of the craft was left going round the moon, supposedly, and the rest of them went down in the little capsule part of it, and then that would blast off a segment and go back up and reunite with a guy that was circling the moon, and then they join together and go back to the Earth and so on. That's how it was supposed to be. But so they explained all this. Never mind the flag waving in the wind, which shouldn't be there because there's no atmosphere in the moon. But facts don't matter when there's big agendas. But you also saw the ship going in towards the moon after it separated. And I thought, well, if that guy's still in orbiting the moon there and part of the craft, who's following them down with the camera? Because you saw that falling right down, and it was years and years later before they admitted it was a simulation. Well, why would you present it as real if you're giving us drawings and simulations? It's the greatest way to con the public, though. And, it's to make them... Make you what? Why not just say we can't follow it in because there's no one to follow it in? Why lie to the public? Once you start lying, you got to start questioning everything. And the same with the AIDS one, half virus and half bacteria. And they gave you half the page in one of the daily tabloid papers in Britain. So you opened the page and there's this big monster staring at you. This was the AIDS thing. This thing is going to devour the world. And the World Health Organization had all these statistics again, even then, I think it was before Neil Ferguson came out with his computer systems and that. Maybe not. Maybe it was on the go then too. But they had it worked out the percentage of folk who would get it by the year until literally about half the planet, maybe 3/4 of the planet would get it and maybe even perish from it by year 2000. But, so there's nothing new under the sun. The techniques to terrify you are awfully good. So they studied that. And they did all these, for years and years, they kept putting out circular little studies. And would you fill this in? And are you terrified of ever catching this or that? And what do you think about it? What's your opinion of it? Or yada, 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 So they can actually judge your stress level. It's much better now with computers. They get instant feedback from people all the time who are quite happy to fill in and tick off boxes for every possible reason. They don't even know who it's from most of the time. They just do it. I guess they're trained already. So they get an idea of how well something's working in a terror campaign. But when you understand psychological warfare, you've got to understand that's how you really are ruled. That's how you've always been ruled. And you've got to understand too, there's other things. Forget the people in the streets who are furious, and some of them are a ninja. But there's also a generation getting written off here because the factories were given off to China by the politicians and are bringing in the COVID lockdowns. It's the same groups and same descendants of the same families, by the way, that are still in charge of everything. Like 40-year periods, 50-year periods. And so they're going to give you a lockdown, and they've written off a generation. And they're giving them a universal basic income. There's no mobility allowed anymore. And for them, once you're on that income, that's you finished, Certain minorities will get certain benefits or can climb the ladder or get priorities in universities and stuff like that. But for the rest, you're written off already. And so you can understand there's definitely more to this unhappiness than just BLM or Antifa. And Antifa groups too, the fronts, as you well know, are the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of revolutionaries. So, but the rest of the folk who follow are really discontented people, the ordinary folk, And they're just full of rage and fury because they have been written off. And I was thinking about that too, this right-wing, left-wing nonsense that they give you in most countries. It was always meant to stop revolutions. Because all sides are corrupt. And you're not voting in new people because you like them. It's because you're so sick of the last lot you voted for that obviously proved their corruption. And that's why that's a great way to stop revolutions from happening every 5 years or so. Just vote someone else in. And yet for years now, and years, it's been like they give them 2 terms. It's Britain and here and everywhere else. It's almost like it's customary now. It saves them a lot of time and money to go through the predictable elections. And it doesn't really matter so much when they're putting the same folk in for 2 terms. It saves them retraining another coterie around them that work with them. It's much more efficient for them. Everything's about efficiency on behalf of those that rule and own you. And they talk quite openly about owning you, all the big rich folk on the planet. That, again, are presented as somehow stars. They have the right to decide how you're going to live. Because they're rich, you see. That's it. I mean, do you think Bezos and all these characters, do you get a chance to vote for them and everything? Anyone? No. Of course you don't. So why are you accepting all this? Why are you accepting a United Nations that you can't vote for either? Your parents didn't get to vote for them, to get them in. Your grandparents didn't get to vote for the United Nations or the League of Nations, So why you can go along with something that's got no democracy of any kind involved in it? Why on earth would you go along with something like this? And forget it's massive publicity campaigns and public relations and as I tell you how wonderful it is and all the wonderful things that they're doing. And don't kid yourself. You can get the greatest tyrants in history nowadays they've ever seen before in history, dressed up in suits and ties, or women's business outfits and so on, managing your lives at the United Nations. And they're evil, corrupt sods. I'm being awfully polite here, but terribly, terribly corrupt. And they know what they're doing. They know their whole job is to con the public of the whole planet into a global system of sustainability on behalf of those who really put the money in their pockets at the top. And the WHO as well. A good chunk of the WHO is owned by Bill Gates. Small coterie, really, when you look around you. But again, back to the moon, there's the moon, and that's what they pulled off then. And as a child, lots of the children saw that. I said, well, goodness sake. They were supposed to jump like kangaroos, and they could jump over each other, because you'd be 1/6 of the weight, they said, on planet Earth. And they showed you the few pounds that the suits weighed. They were maybe bulky, but they were awfully light. So you wouldn't get hampered with the suit. Well, no, these folk were not jumping high at all. No. They said if you had a golf ball on the moon, it would just go sailing way out of sight, miles away maybe before it landed. That didn't happen either. But facts don't matter when it's big agendas. But look at this. Look at the money and the whole world sat up to watch the moon landing. And the preparation for it took months and months. And I think in Britain they had the head of the observatory for the London, for the Royal Observatory there too. And it was a Moore, I think his name was it Patrick Moore? And even he asked pertinent questions when eventually the Britons, took a few years before they got to see the guys that went to the moon, and he asked some pertinent questions and they couldn't answer him either, like why was there any stars and things, just little things that But anyway, this is what you're ruled with, eh? This is what you're ruled with. And at the same time too, as they're lauding this moon thing, they're teaching children to go under desks in schools, so they'll grow up in this thought of fear, but their governments are taking care of them. If those bad guys want to blow you to smithereens, your guys are going to tax your parents big time to get better missiles to blow all them out of the planet, and then you'd all go up in smoke. But at least you had the satisfaction that the whole planet was gone. That made a lot of sense. But that's what they kept folk going with for years, and generations grew up with that too. And psychiatrists made a fortune, and therapists, come in and tell us your problems. And all these folk would come in there, and they even had little groups, grief groups, before anything happened, in case it ever got blown up. I was wondering what happened if we all got blown up tonight. I had the same thought, and they'd share their experience. They don't pass information, they share things, Very communistic. But that's the world that you're brought up in, and you're taught that this is normal. I mentioned before the movie called Threads in Britain, but a documentary came along with it where they interviewed the guys that were in charge of not just the military but the police for the whole of Britain, and what they would do during. I said, oh yeah, we'll follow this to the letter, just like the movie, and shoot folk in the streets if you were out there looking for food. And this is after a nuclear war, if ever happened, eh? And again, you're taught that that's normal. Are you getting the picture here? Government, in a sense, exists to supposedly stabilize into a system the chaos around that you'd have without government. And long, long ago, it lost any pretense of that when they went into overlords, you see. And once you have overlords, then the greatest way to do it, not to bring peace and security inside the nation, is to, look at this folk over there, they're going to slaughter you unless we're here to defend you and save you. And so off comes the tax money again, and you got whole tiers of bureaucrats in uniform and outside of uniform, all working for military organizations and so on. And then you have psychologists, because you could have the mind control guys and behaviorists and neuroscientists, and how can you use them to keep the public being more efficiently working towards you, the system that you're designing and the changes you're bringing in too, without falling apart. So they do their best to make sure they can manipulate the minds of the public without the public being aware that they're being brainwashed and manipulated. And we've had that our whole lives long, and so did your parents before you too, and grandparents. It's so amazing when you go in, as I say, to Bernays. This guy, they made him a star. Edward, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who supposedly used his uncle's techniques of understanding the subconscious, almost the unconscious but subconscious drives, the things that drive you that you're not really aware of and all that, and harness them into advertising and techniques to make you happy. Remember what you're getting at wellness, oh, how is your wellness today? Oh, I don't know. That all comes from the same techniques that Bernays was into as well, and Freud, etc., would replace real happiness or contentment. Contentment's a more realistic term that you should strive for. You'll never get fully content, but the things you get contentment is better than being manically happy all the time and on pills. Because they try to say that if you're not laughing and out playing and having lots of sex, then there's something wrong with you. And they've trained a whole generation, actually 2 generations, that was the normal, all from Freud's nonsense. Even though Freud said he was there to destroy the system and destroy society coming in the boat to New York. And folk don't even know the story behind that. But anyway, and he really meant it. But there's Bernays, the nephew. And Freud, again, had the Oedipus complex, but it wasn't so much his mum he was into, it was Bernays' wife. But it's all in the family with these characters. But you'll find that Bernays it became like an advisor to governments, not just one, a few different presidents. And he actually used governments to his own advantage. He even set up a company, a film company, like Pathy News, that was shown in the cinemas, worrying about the terrible dangers of communism taking over one of the Latin American countries. That was Venezuela, where it was. It's where the Great American Fruit Company was stationed, a big US or New York company. And the country had voted in a president. And Bernays and all the shareholders were worried, you see, that oh my goodness, they might nationalize the company and start to keep money for themselves, for the country, for goodness sake. You can't have that. And so they used the US, they got the US military to go in and overthrow the president that had been elected. That was years ago. And that's what he did. And the public didn't mind because they'd seen all the different newscasts that he'd made before, preparing their minds for it. Oh yeah, if I got that, it's over there, it's overthrown. It wasn't communists. It was just that the people wanted more of a share in keeping some of the money from their produce in their own country. And anyway, that was Bernays. And he was so effective at it that President Wilson, that said he got elected when he said he'd never bring America into the World War, the Great War. It was on the go. And because he lied, naturally, because that's why they picked these guys. But Bernays was appointed to find ways to gradually persuade Americans to be all for the war. It took him a few years, but he came out with a book and different things and a massive propaganda campaign about the terrible Huns, the same old stuff he was in Britain. The same kind of stuff, actually, with bayoneting children and all that stuff that they used for Serbia years and years later, and Bosnia. So it's the same stuff, like the dog. Always the same techniques, you see, to get the public, oh my, that's terrible, they can't get away with that, we must do. And it was all to make sure that America would go into the war. But 1917, after 3 years of the American banks, basically mainly New York, financing all sides in the war to make sure they'd all get their money back for the loans, regardless of who apparently won. But America was to be the arbiter of it, and so they sent the American troops. This is all history, folks. This really happened this way. You know? So much so that Bernays put a book out under propaganda and public relations that he renamed it Public Relations. It sounds better than propaganda. Boasting about how he and teams of folk that were employed under him got America into World War I. That's how cocky they are, you know, these psychopaths. You know? They love to boast, don't they? But that's what you're living under. And so people had grandparents that fought in World War I. You know, they're all dying off now, all the grandchildren. But yet these guys went off thinking they're going to have to fight for the good of nations. Britain still doesn't know why it went, really. Those the British folk don't know, and so on. There's definitely some stirring powers, but you see France on the border of Germany, sure. We know that Britain, or London, I most particularly London, the city of London, they ran the whole empire, like a private business really, knew that Germany was way ahead with their industrial revolution, that was surpassing Britain, and that their workers were happier, they got paid more, they actually had pension plans then too for Germans, can you believe that? Before World War I broke out even. And they brought in social credit systems too for welfare and all that. Britain was still called the poor man of Europe. There's nothing for the peasants in Britain. And it showed in the work and so on. It went down the hill, and Germany was out producing them. So they wanted to rectify that problem. And that's what they did, to get a war going with Germany. There's no doubt about it. That was a big part of it. I've mentioned it too, that there was a good musical, believe it or not, a musical kind of parody on World War I, to show you that it was a satire, to show you the farce of the wars you're taught to honour, right? Like World War I, and one was called "Oh, What a Lovely War," and it shows you in sing-song form the outbreak of war, and it's hitting England, and then people are at the beach, they're at Brighton or somewhere, and they open up these recruitment offices, and they're all happy singing these recruitment songs, which literally were churned out by the propaganda machine from government. You always get this kind of stuff. And today, it's Hollywood in the States, and No One Left Behind sort of movies and that kind of thing, getting youngsters all keen to go. But back then it was songs. They churned out the songs and stage plays like you wouldn't believe. And little ditty songs, little hooks in them, little chorus type hooks, so you start singing along with. And it was right down to the kinds of shells that you would meet in the trenches that would go above your head. Some of them whizzing, like circular, almost like fireworks. And these ones had names like whiz bangs and things like that. And they named the songs after them. It's all jolly good fun, don't you know? And everybody initially in the movie, I think, was called Smiths and things like that, because they're showing you that the ordinary folk were the folk mainly who were going in to get slaughtered. It was, and I get to see satire, and really, I guess, measured across much better than so-called poignant movies, where they show you the emotions involved of the people involved and so on. But they never turn around to how ridiculous the whole thing is in the first place. But in What a Lovely War, they actually have little scenes in it where you see the producers and the folk of international investments and armaments and so on, talking about some of their factories getting blown up in France, next when Germany or Belgium and so on, and how they're putting lodges complaints in by their lawyers to the British government for blowing up their factories, and they would get recompense for it. This is what wars are. It's a massive business, for goodness sake. Massive. I can remember after, I think it was in the 80s maybe, they finally, or maybe late 70s, but they finally agreed to recompense, I think it was maybe Ford or GM plant in Germany. They got bombed by the British and the American Air Forces during the war, World War II. And the company eventually put in a lawsuit, and they got recompense for the loss of their factories and the loss of the work that they would have produced if they'd been still standing. And just astonishing what really goes on, folks. This is reality here. You're run by evil tyrants that employ the best minds. As far as IQ levels go, it's nothing to do with intelligence, really. There's a difference. I shouldn't say IQ. I've met people, like con people at the bottom level, who are sharp as razors. They can see through any scam before you open your mouth. They can read you. A good con man will read you like a book, because they're psychopaths. They don't have to work at it. It just comes to them like a gift. But if there's nothing from you that they want, they'll chat quite openly about what they do and how they do it. And any topic that comes up to do with politics, they can see right through scams and how to get more welfare money, and they can reel off laws that you've never even heard of. When it comes to any academia, no, so you wouldn't say that. It's a kind of strange parallel intelligence. It's a different type of intelligence. It's almost got the intellect of a predator, of a snake that's going around looking for mice or rats to swallow or something like that. It's got that kind of, and that's what it's like, because they are predators, you see. And they do awfully well for themselves. But then when you meet the ones at the top that sit and do the planning for these wars, I mean, look at the PNAC group that gave you a list of countries that wanted to be taken in the 1990s, before they had their Pearl Harbor event, which they said they would need to get American support behind them. And bingo, the 9/11 comes along. You can't make this stuff up. And you're taught to believe in coincidence theories. Oh, just a coincidence. They made up these lists and published it twice and had sworn oaths to do it and all that. And then they got their wish and got American public support behind them. And so, yeah, it's just a coincidence. Right? It's the same thing with your COVID-19. And they said at the meeting, it was like the final switch to turn on COVID. At the last year's summit, conference of parties for the climate change groups. It's the same groups behind that too, the richest folk on the planet, the same folk at the World Economic Forum, it's all the same people. And he said the people aren't listening to us, and they're not going to cut back on everything, and they're not going to reduce their populations voluntarily, etc. So we've got to do something more drastic, they said. Well, bingo! And before the year's actually out comes COVID-19. They called it the Wuhan virus initially. And they had about 4 different name changes before they settled on COVID-19, coronavirus 19. And someone say COVID-SARS virus, COVID-SARS virus. Astonishing, eh? But anyway, they give you nice drawings of these mines, these floating mines in the air, and they're hard in the sea, and pretty colours in them too. You swear they're made of wool, wouldn't you? Eh? I'm surprised. I wonder if they're making them like wool balls like that now and selling them for the children to make sure they grow up terrified of them as well. But this is what runs you. This is what runs your lives, and you don't know it. You don't know your whole life you're in a movie. You really are. It's like you're in a movie. And you'll all get faced or presented with challenges that you think, and you will all come to the conclusion, or most of you will, I think it's 97% of the folk all go along with agendas regardless, But they'll come to conclusions that it just happens by coincidence. Whoever is, another crash came 2008. Oh my goodness, it just, I was giving the talks long before that the bankers always crash you and loot you at least twice a century, on a big scale, and then minor ones in between. But there's a big one, 2007-8, and like everything else, you never mind this stuff around 9/11. I won't even go into that, to do with insurance for the buildings and for the company. Remember that all the stocks in the airplane companies literally drastically changed the day before the bombings and stuff. Never mind the folk who didn't turn up for work that day. Never mind all these inconvenient facts. Facts don't matter. Same kind of thing, but that's a reality with the COVID thing as well. You see, facts don't matter. And so it doesn't matter that the elite already said that the peasants aren't listening to us. They're still breeding, and they're still wanting to consume and have new cars and things, and have decent transportation and cheap gasoline, and they're still driving those terrible gasoline cars, for goodness sake. They won't take Mr. So-and-so's electric ones, which are twice the price and don't last that long because the batteries cost half the price of your car, and you can't. But inconvenient facts, eh? So bingo, COVID breaks out, eh? Then, after all, it comes out from official sources where it came from. We find out where a coronavirus was given to that lab over yonder. continue with gain of function, to make it more virulent and deadly.
Question everything.